Hello, and welcome to my session on Business Process Automation is Not Dead. In today's session, I will discuss various forms and workflow solutions available by Microsoft that have been used previously for SharePoint, and also look at new solutions that are available today that would help us address the needs for Office 365 Business Process Automation. My name is Haniel Croitoru, and I'm lead consultant with Tutor Lead out of Toronto, Canada. I have been working in the Microsoft and Office 365 space over the last 15 years and have seen a lot of new tools evolve to become what is a great ecosystem that we can leverage today for our business process automation. Let's get into it. Workflows have been an important part of SharePoint for some time now. In the past, there were 4 different options available. You could either leverage out-of-the-box workflows, such as approval workflow, publishing workflow, or 3-stage workflow, to name a couple. You could use SharePoint Designer to create custom workflows, use Visual Studio to do custom development with the most flexibility, or leverage some third-party tools such as Nintex or K2, to name a couple. Over time, these needs have changed now that we're talking about Office 365, because some of these workflow solutions are very specific to SharePoint and don't really provide a lot of flexibility beyond. Similarly, there were a number of options available for forms in SharePoint. You could use the out-of-the-box SharePoint forms, leverage Excel services, use InfoPath forms to create customized forms with more flexibility, use SharePoint Designer that would also give you some more flexibility, custom development in Visual Studio, which is typically the option for most flexible forms, Access database forms if you were using an Access database inside of SharePoint, or third-party solutions such as the ones I mentioned before or other products. So with so many options available, you might ask yourself, why do we need to look at other options, other solutions? The reason is, again, that in the past, a lot of these solutions were very SharePoint-centric. But now that we have moved to the cloud and are using a lot of the Office 365 applications and services, we need to look beyond SharePoint and find better and more effective ways to manage our content in the forms, as well as the workflows that are going to be acting on that content. Microsoft Flow has been released about a year and a half ago and has grown very rapidly in popularity because of its ease of use and great extensibility. The workflows are trigger-based, which means that an event has to happen, such as a document getting uploaded into a library, another system triggering it, timer, or even having someone on a mobile device pressing a button to force the workflow to kick off. When you create a workflow, you're able to template it, which means that in the future, if you want to create another workflow with similar functionality, you can basically use the template as a starting point. And one important differentiator from other services is that you can actually share the workflow with other users. For example, in SharePoint Designer, if you wanted to ever do any sort of copying or even back up a workflow, that was always a very difficult task to perform. Today, there are over 200 different connectors available to many cloud-based systems, as well as gateways to connect to several on-premise systems. With such flexibility, you can imagine how easy it becomes to manage the data across the different services. In the past, This would have required an extensive amount of customizations or dealing with third-party solutions to try and integrate these workflows together. Furthermore, if the actions available in Microsoft Flow don't provide you with the necessary functionality, you can always use expressions to further drill into the data and manipulate it to your needs. Microsoft Flow is available to Office 365 Enterprise, Business, and Education plans, as well as Dynamics 365 Enterprise and Business plans. There is a free version, however, is limited to the number of executions you can perform per month. And then there are additional versions of Microsoft Flow plans with an additional cost that provide you more flexibility. Next on the list is Azure LogicApps. It's very similar in functionality to Microsoft Flow, but does offer you some additional features such as PowerShell access and Visual Studio and some additional connectors. Keep in mind that you need to have an Azure tenant in order to leverage Azure LogicApps. Pricing for Azure LogicApps is also calculated differently. Rather than looking at the number of total executions, LogicApps are calculated based on the number of actions as well as the number of standard connectors and enterprise connectors used for every execution. Azure Functions are event-driven, which means that they are waiting on a specific trigger in order to start. And the purpose is typically to run a small piece of code to achieve a specific goal. One of the key advantages is that with Azure Functions, you don't need to rely on any infrastructure as it runs inside of Azure and is essentially what is called serverless. So all you need to worry about is the actual tasks that are going to be performed. Now, these Azure Functions are typically written in programming languages or in scripts. They're not visual in nature, which is why I refer to them as being developer-centric or level 300. If you imagine level 100 being a completely user interface type workflow, and a level 200 being one that requires some familiarity of scripting or configurations. In Azure Functions, developers get access to the triggers and connectors, as in LogicApps or Flow, but they also get access to a number of Azure storage solutions so that once the workflow has completed, or the function, that data will remain persistent for future access. With Azure Functions, developers are not limited to just using expressions or the actions available, but can actually use a number of programming languages that they're used to, as well as scripting languages to achieve their goals. On top of that, Azure Functions offers different continuous integration options, such as Visual Studio, GitHub, and Bitbucket. And it allows developers a lot more freedom to monitor, control, and share their solutions with others. For Azure Functions, the pricing model is actually different than that of Flow and LogicApps, where you're actually looking at something called a consumption plan, where it looks at, for example, disk space, the CPU used, the networking used, and based on that, the cost is being calculated. Or if you already have an app service plan, then you can simply leverage that towards the executions of the Azure Functions. The last workflow option I mentioned before is Azure WebJobs. It is similar to the Azure Functions in that you can use different programming languages and scripts to achieve your goals. However, in order to run a web job, you need to have a virtual machine available to run them on, as well as these web jobs get created and managed outside of Azure. So this would be done, for example, using Visual Studio, and then they get uploaded into the Azure portal. Now, web jobs, unlike the Azure Functions, can either be running continuous or be set to start on a specific trigger. So keep in mind, if you do have a virtual machine already available in Azure, you could simply piggyback the Azure WebJobs to run on that, and then there would be no additional cost. However, if you don't currently have a virtual machine, the cost may be more significant to run these jobs. So as you can see, in the 4 workflow options I've presented, one commonality is that they all leverage these connectors. This is a really important point, which gives you flexibility far beyond SharePoint to manage and interact with content as Office 365 becomes an overarching service that may not even include SharePoint for some users. Now let's look at what options we have available for forms in Office 365. As I mentioned earlier, if we're simply dealing with SharePoint data, we could leverage the SharePoint forms available with the lists and libraries. However, if we need to access data outside of SharePoint, there are options we have. Yammer Pulls, although may not seem an option, allows you to capture some data from users. Then there is Excel services, forms, and last but not least, PowerApps. Let's have a look at those. With SharePoint lists, there is really not much to it. You have the flexibility to configure those inside of your SharePoint list as you need to in order to add or remove any fields or customize the form a little bit. For surveys, if you're going to be doing SharePoint surveys, you get a bit more flexibility in terms of the type of fields you can use, as well as do, for example, logic such as branching. The forms are all driven inside of the browser, and you do have the ability from the forms to export, or from the list to export your data into Excel if you want to manipulate it further. One thing that's great in SharePoint Online today is that you can have native forms kick off Microsoft flows without requiring to do any further customizations. With Yammer integrated into Office 365, you can also look at it as one of the sources of data that you might want to capture. So when a Yammer poll is created, the poll itself could be considered as a type of form that you would want to capture the data of and manipulate. Excel surveys are essentially a specific type of Excel documents that are created in Excel Online, and they can be used to solicit information from users, typically as surveys, but it doesn't have to be a survey. It can be just any type of form. And these forms are responsive, which is great. I mean, you can look at the information at the phone on your phone, interact with it, and also what's really important is it allows anonymous users to submit information. So if you want to get some data from somebody who's outside of your organization, you can do through using the Excel surveys. Now keep in mind that if you do want to use it for surveys, today there's no way to block users from submitting multiple entries for the same survey. So with Excel surveys, you have the option to create 7 different question types, and you can create multiples of each, and also assign default values. However, besides that, there really is no way today to customize your Excel surveys in any other way. If you want to look at the results of the survey, all you need to do is go to the Excel document from where the survey was generated, and you will see the actual survey results tabulated there. Next up is Microsoft Forms. This app was originally created for the education plans, and the intention was to use it to capture exam or test results for students online. Since then, this app has been rolled out to all enterprise tenants, and today it supports a number of different questions as well as branching. It is responsive, which is great. And also you're able to either share it only within the organization or make it publicly available for anonymous users. On first look, you can think of it as being a new incarnation of the Excel survey. And when you start to use it, you really do get a sense that a lot of the functionality has stemmed from the same base. So as you can see, based on the type of questions available, there's only a few: text, choice, date, and rating. And those were originally the ones used for the education plans. So today it hasn't really matured much, but I wouldn't be surprised to see in the future more functionality come together. As well, there's branching available. For those who are not familiar with branching, basically what it means is depending on the answer provided to one question, the user will then be redirected to a different path or a different section within the actual form. For those interested in quiz type functionality, there are still some options available. One of them, the fact that you can specify the start date and the end date when users can submit the answers or the surveys. And all it means is that if somebody tries to fill it out either before or after those dates, they're not able to. And the other one is that the responses for multiple choice are shuffled. So different users or the same user who's going to be looking at the same form on subsequent times may not see the answers in the same order. Finally, there's automatic scoring possible, where the person creating the form can predefine what the correct answer or answers are. And then based on the responses provided by the user, Microsoft Forms can automatically score the results. When you're done collecting your forms, you have 3 different ways to review the results. The first one is viewing it directly within Microsoft Forms Online, where you can see real-time updates, as well as summary graphs for numeric results and ratings, or summaries of the actual text answers being provided. A second way to review the results is similar to the Excel survey, where all the results get exported into an Excel document. Now keep in mind that unlike Excel survey, with forms you have an option to either keep the survey internal or share it anonymously with users. If you choose to make it an internal survey, then the username who's submitting it will be provided in one of the columns together with the rest of the results. If it is an anonymous survey, then the username is not being provided. And this is really important, where if you may choose to have a survey that you want to keep it truly anonymous, for example, for human resource purposes, then users can be reassured that there's no way to find out who's actually submitted the survey and who didn't, or what answers were provided by whom. And the third and final way to capture the results from forms submitted is using Flow. And this is my personal favorite, because what it allows you to do is iterate through all the results, look at all the values, and then manipulate them or store them in a SharePoint list or many of the other services provided or accessible through Microsoft Flow, as discussed earlier. And the final form solution I'd like to discuss today for Office 365 is PowerApps. This is by far the best one available. It offers you a lot of customization and flexibility, is mobile friendly, integrates with most of these connectors I've mentioned earlier, as well as today when you're working in SharePoint Online, you can actually choose to have PowerApps be the default form for you. So with very little changes necessary, you can actually set up a very appealing and user-friendly form rather than leveraging the SharePoint out-of-the-box form for your SharePoint lists. With PowerApps, you have the choice to either build your apps directly using the web browser or download the dedicated app. Now, unlike the other form solutions, PowerApps gives you a lot of flexibility in incorporating rich media such as images or videos, and really customize the user interface to your liking. And since it's running as an actual application on your mobile device, there's an actual app that needs to run underneath the specific Power App, it is able to interact with the hardware. So you can actually interact with the camera and interact with the GPS to get coordinates and leverage those inside of your app, making it so much more powerful than just a simple form that is collecting user data. Even within the simple fields, you get a lot of flexibility in how you want it to behave. You can set default values, you can link specific fields or specific controls to other components and make one field update based on another one. You have a lot of flexibility around the look and feel. Virtually almost endless options available to you in PowerApps that the other forms options just don't give you. Once again, like the Microsoft Flow and other workflow solutions, PowerApps allows you to integrate with almost 200 different connectors so that when you're loading your initial form, you're not just presenting the user with a blank form, but rather you can actually pull data from these services and surface them directly in your PowerApp form so that you have a much better starting point and requiring less user input from your users. With PowerApps as well as Microsoft Flow, you're able to integrate something called a common data model, which essentially allows you to share data between the different applications and also persist the data once the workflow has finished executing. So again, this is a great advantage that the other form solutions just don't have. The only one would be SharePoint, where you would have to customize potentially a lookup to another list to be able to retrieve information. So again, a big advantage here. There are 3 different pricing tiers available to PowerApps, and it really depends on the number of executions per month, similar to Microsoft Flow. If you go with a paid model, you obviously have more options available to you, but there's also the common data model that is only available to a paid service, as well as some of the enterprise connectors that are only available to paid services. In a very short time, we just covered 4 different workflow solutions and 5 form solutions. We could easily spend a few hours on each one of those to dive much, much deeper to get a better understanding. But what I'm hoping is that this has given you the tip of the iceberg to get an understanding of what you want to use. I'd like to close off by giving you a summary of the options for workflows and forms and key points to consider. For workflows, the key items you want to consider are infrastructure, whether you already have Azure subscription or not, and if you're running any services that you can then piggyback your workflows on. The development, which is basically the level of knowledge you have for those who are going to be building the workflows. Are they developers? Are they business people who are not familiar with programming or scripting? And the third one is the budget. Is there a budget available for additional budget for running these kind of workflows, or do you need to consider types of workflows that are going to be free? Now, this is not to say that you have to stick to only one type of workflow. You could actually mix and match and find a way to keep the cost to a minimum while still achieving the goals you want to achieve with them. Also, what's important to consider here is that you can actually have the workflows mix and match where a flow could kick off an Azure function or similarly. But again, what you need to consider is if that happens, is all of those types of executions are counting towards your quotas, so there may be a cost implicated. And finally, for the form solutions, you want to look at the structure on how the questions are built and how the data gets managed, the user experience involved in building these forms and how they're being viewed by the users and completed, and then the responses of the forms. Where do you see the results? How can you manipulate them? Do they go into any sort of workflows, or do you need to export them and deal with them manually? Thank you again for joining me on my session today. I hope you found this information valuable. If you have any other questions or would like to discuss things further, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you. Bye-bye.